I'm John Buchanan. Now, you know me, I like to respond to the requests that come in via the channel whenever I possibly can. And yes, I know we need to make MIDI in part 3. Be patient. In the meantime, another request that comes up all the time and which we're going to address in this video is the idea of working with sub-bass. You're welcome, you know who you are. Okay, now listen, why have I put off this moment? Well, let me answer that question by offering you a kind of government health warning. If you're listening on studio monitors, maybe be ready to turn the volume down a little bit because we're going to play some really low frequencies and some of them are going to be quite loud. The other thing to say is, if you're listening on a laptop, be ready for most of this video to appear to be relatively silent, because of course the thing about sub-bass, true sub-bass, is that, as we're about to discover, it is interested only in occupying the lowest frequencies of our mix. Now, to really understand what we might refer to as sub-bass, we need to understand a little bit about the way that synthesizers make sounds and what they are made up of. And what we have in any synth sound is what we refer to as a fundamental frequency, the note that we actually play, and then what we have is a series of harmonics that play on top of it. Harmonics are bits of signal that are mathematically related to the core note that we play and which add overtones to the sound. White noise is the most complicated sound we can play, which is every single frequency playing back at the same volume, which is why we can't detect pitch in white noise. But most synths, what they do is they give us a nice round fundamental and a series of appropriate harmonics. And what we can then do is to build sounds of all descriptions, whether you want a kind of searing trance lead sound or a nicely rounded bass sound. Now, when it comes to bass, and sub-bass particularly, what tends to happen if you load sounds that have got the word sub or sine in them is that what you'll end up with is a sound which is incredibly pure. And by pure, what I mean is a waveform which doesn't really have a whole lot of harmonic content. And to show you what I mean by that, I'm going to do two things. Firstly, I'm going to open up the glorious ES2 interface, which remains, as always, just a stone cold classic. And the second thing I'm going to do is to remind you that you might want to reach for your volume control. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play some notes and they're going to be low. And what we're going to do is to play down through an octave and they're going to get lower. And you're going to learn a number of things about the room in which you are listening to this sound. You're going to probably discover that some notes seem a lot louder than others. And you might find that some disappear altogether. Let's find out. We're going to start on a D. Okay, how many of the notes did you hear? How many of them set off things in your room that started rattling? So what we need to know is a whole bunch of things that are happening simultaneously. And this is where sub-bass and the management of sub-bass becomes completely complicated. Not completely complicated, but relatively complicated. Okay, so let's deal with a few things first. When I play a note in a synthesizer like the ES2, and it plays out through my audio interface to my speakers, suddenly my speakers have to vibrate in sympathy with the notes that I'm playing. In other words, when I play a note, the cone starts to rattle. And if I play a sub-bass sound by itself with nothing else playing, the only thing the speaker has to do is to produce that one individual frequency. But if it turns out that, let's suppose I was to play a note which had a frequency of 20 hertz, which is more or less sort of considered to be about the lowest frequency that most human beings can hear. That's the kind of rumble of the underground subway train that's coming towards you from the station late at night. That kind of rumble, you feel it before you hear it. That speaker cone is going to vibrate 20 times per second. But of course, electronically, we can produce sounds that can play much lower than 20 hertz. And if I was to play a note that only vibrated 1 time per second, you would see your speaker cone literally moving 1 cycle per second, once per second, forwards and backwards, moving through the sine wave that was generating it. Does that make sense? I hope it does. So what we've got is this sense of a very pure signal which the speaker is attempting to reproduce. So why might these notes be different volumes? Well, firstly, What pair of speakers do you have? How does it deal with low frequency? So if you're dealing with a pair of absolutely weapons grade studio monitors, what you'll discover is that they're calibrated to perform or to provide playback to ultra low frequencies at a level that is maintained. But if you're working on a much smaller pair of studio near fields, let's say, and there are lots of those that are compact and easy to take from one place to another and not too heavy, all that kind of stuff, great, until you suddenly need really accurate bass playback, because you might find that the frequency content of your speakers begins to attenuate. And what that means is, as we get towards lower frequency content, the volume of those gets quieter. And by the time you get anywhere near 20 hertz or 30 or even 40, the speaker simply cannot produce that signal. Now, the reason why that matters is if you have got those frequencies in the tracks that you're working on, in the kick drums you program, in the bass lines you write, there's no way that you can accurately mix those. You have to just go with some intuition, or you may well find that when you take your music somewhere else and play it back on a different pair of speakers, it doesn't sound quite the same way that it did in your room. That's the first thing. Keeping up? Of course you are. The other thing is that your room may not be acoustically treated. And what that means is that as these waveforms make their way into the room, all of their wavelengths will begin at various points to start vibrating in sympathy with the length of your room. Remember, a waveform as played out of a speaker has a wavelength. And as a result of that length, as it snakes its way into the room via its sine wave, if it just so happens that the wavelength perfectly matches the length of your room, it will be amplified. So rather than being sort of broken down, it will be re-amplified by the room, whereas other frequencies may just be sort of out of tune with the dimensions of your room, and they will be attenuated in different ways. These not terribly attractive grey panels that have been in the background throughout this channel are obviously designed in my room to keep frequency content as even as possible. They're not very beautiful to look at, but they do a really nice job. And whilst I played down through that octave, interesting things happened at various frequencies, more or less the volume of that set of notes remained fairly consistent in here, albeit the keyboard stand over there began to vibrate at different frequencies, which was kind of exciting. So if we suddenly thought, okay, well, why are we trying to bother with sine waves and to produce bass lines made out of something quite so pure? That's actually a really good question, because potentially one solution to the problem of bass lines getting lost when they're that pure is that we could simply add extra frequency content to them. We could open up their filter section, we could bring in some of those harmonics that I mentioned, the sound will get thicker, and in doing so, more frequencies in more audible range of the spectrum will suddenly be part of the experience of that bass, and as a result it will make its presence felt all the way through the frequency area. Well, that's a really good idea. Let's do that next. What I'm going to do is to unmute this little bass line that I've written. I'm going to solo it so we can hear it by itself. Sounds like this. Classic sine wave murky bass line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to filter this sound to bring in extra frequency content. Oh, it turns out that actually the filter is already as open as it can possibly be. And this is the sound that we're listening to. There is no way for me to bring extra frequency content to this particular sound using excuse me, using a synthesizer. I was so choked by the idea that I couldn't add extra harmonic content that it just took me a moment to recover. Why is that? Well, it's because the waveform that I'm using is a sine wave, the simplest waveform there is, a pure undulating sine wave, which has no harmonic content, zero. So there are no extra harmonics I can bring to this sound. I cannot do it within this synthesizer. There is a chance that I can actually just filter this sound, this waveform out altogether. Let's see if that will happen. With apologies to your neighbours. You can't hear it anymore, but they might be able to. It's like that moment where, you know, the freshly driving licensed 17-year-old drives past with their enormous sound system, and in their car, the bass is quite big. But in your flat, 300 yards away, it's really big, because of course what's happened again is the wavelength is too long for the vehicle in question, but it absolutely explodes as they drive past where you live. It's never that fun, is it? But it does tell us something about sub-bass. So sine waves can't be sort of enriched with extra harmonics because they simply don't exist. So we can't do that. So that's not going to help us. What we actually need to do if we want extra harmonics in this sound is to introduce those in a slightly different way. So how might we do that? Well, the way that we can definitely introduce harmonics is via a plugin like, let's say, Chromaglow. So Chromaglow is going to allow me to bring harmonics via saturation via a number of different routes. So if I was to add tube saturation to this sound, we've got this pure sine wave, but what it's going to do is to start generating harmonics through a number of sort of simulated models. And suddenly we've got a sound which is richer in frequency content. Now, to really demonstrate what I mean by that, firstly, I'm going to bypass Chromaglow, and it's time we did some analysis. And actually, to do that analysis, I'm going to break my channel rule, and I'm going to come to a third-party plugin. Can you believe it? We're going to look at the Pro Q4. And the reason for this is it's going to give us frequency analysis in a way that the channel EQ just isn't. Let's have a listen to our original bass line again. Let's have a look at it, and let's have a look at its harmonic content. So there isn't any. What we've got is this enormous kind of lump at the fundamental. We've got a little bit of frequency content, but it's a lot quieter than everything else. And every once in a while the sound ticks, and we can hear that up here in upper frequency content, but it's not really part of the oscillator of this, the experience of this sound. Now, if I punch Chromaglow back in and I turn the drive amount back up, we're going to see something slightly different when we look at the Pro Q4, because we're suddenly going to discover that this oscillator has got harmonics. When I leave the mouse there, we'll actually have a chance to see all of the frequency content that has been introduced as a result of driving the signal a little bit more. Now, synth waveforms can do this too. And of course, most synth sounds are based on a fundamental frequency, a bit like our sine wave, but with built-in harmonic content, which we can manipulate. So we could take a sawtooth wave, for instance, and we could filter it all the way down until it becomes a pure fundamental. But of course, if we open the cutoff frequency back up again, we get all of that harmonic content, and we get the presence in the sound in that way. So if you are thinking about, I want to understand some ways to manage sub within my tracks, the first thing to know is if you are dealing with a completely pure sine wave, really the only thing you can do is to set its volume where you think it's right. And that's all you can do if you want to deal with the purest sound in that form. If, however, what you want is a kind of more regularity, or you want that sound to have a bit more presence, one thing you might choose to do, if you are going to insist on using a pure sine wave, would be to introduce some distortion or some saturation, which is going to provide you with some harmonic content, which is just going to provide you with a kind of safety net. It's providing you with extra presence in the sound, and suddenly our bass line stretches up into the low mid-range, and indeed the mid-range, and even the beginning of the treble range as well. It's a bigger, fatter experience, and that's going to be a way of being able to manage it. What we're also going to do is to look at another really important thing when it comes to why it matters that you get sub under control. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to turn this off for a second. I'm going to turn off Chromaglow, and I'm going to turn off the Pro Q4, so we're back to just our pure sine bass. And now what I am going to do is I'm going to play you this track in context with 2 beat loops that are underneath it as well. So here is the sine bass and 2 beat loops. Sorry, it was a little loud, but I've turned everything down. I've turned it down together. So we've got, well, not much headroom, but things aren't peaking anymore. Okay, now then, where am I going with this? What I'm actually going to do for a second is I'm going to mute the original sine bass. And what I'm going to do is to use another FabFilter plugin. I know, it's that day, isn't it? All the rules are getting broken. This is the Pro C2. This is a stereo compressor. And again, I'm using it for two reasons. Firstly, we're going to have a chance to really see exactly what's happening, and we're going to learn how we might be able to slightly fix that too. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off automatic gain. I'm going to set a threshold relatively high. This mix is loud, and I've put this on the stereo output, which means that everything in this mix is coming into my compressor. And I'm going to set a relatively generous ratio as well. So we're really going to have a chance to have the bits of detected signal which are going to be compressed, get compressed a fair amount. And what I'm looking for here is maybe to try and find a place within the kind of volume balance of this sound where we're losing about 3 decibels of volume out of the loudest moments, so we can see what those loudest moments are. Okay, so let's unmute the two beat loops, but keep the bass lines. I've got another one to play you in a little while. Let's keep the bass lines out of this for a moment. So let's just find that place within the compressor. It's interruption time again. You know me, and you know I love an interruption. This time, however, I've got exciting news. There is a new series on learn.johnnybuchananmusic.com, which I'm calling Essentials. These are video manuals for the biggest topics relating to everything to do with music, music making, and production. If you want to learn about music theory, this is the place to go. If you want to really take a deep dive into the concepts of pitch, rhythm and groove, or indeed how to oversee the volume management of all of your tracks, all of your productions, this is the place to go. And Essentials is going to continue to expand with new courses over the coming months. Think about these as the building blocks that underpin all of music making whenever you're working with technology, and they'll give you a foundation for all of your songwriting ideas, for your mixes, for your productions, and everything you need to know about music making, which you can then apply to the music that you want to make. If that sounds exciting to you, head to learn.johnnybuchananmusic.com at the end of this video, perhaps. So which bit of the waveform is being detected and compressed? Well, it's the bass, it's the kick drum, because that's where the biggest amount of energy is, as we've already established within the bass lines that we've been listening to. These ultra low frequencies have an enormous amount of energy. So therefore they produce this volume spike. And what tends to happen when we compress signals is that, of course, it's the bass end that makes the compressor work the hardest. And we're seeing that really clearly. The bits that don't contain any bass are barely compressed. Remember, what we're looking at in the waveform here is that this red line is going to drop to show me the amount of volume loss from every bit of the waveform as we play it back. And we're going to find that all the bits without a kick drum don't compress very hard, and all the bits with a kick drum compress up to about -3 dB. Let's just look at it one more time. Okay, what we're going to do now is we are going to bring in the sine bass part so that it also becomes part of the experience of this sound, and we'll see what happens to the compressor. Oh dear. Do you make tracks where you have built this beautiful intro and you have this kind of bars, pause, and then bang, everything comes in and the vocal goes nuts and the arrangement gets bigger, and that's where you drop the sub bass, and actually it feels to you like suddenly everything in your mix gets quieter rather than louder? Well, we've all experienced that moment at some point in our lives, and it's always a massive anticlimax and a huge disappointment. And now you know why. So the moment we bring in all of this ultra low frequency content and we've got a stereo compressor sitting in the output channel of our mix, the problem is that the compressor is going, oh my God, I've got to deal with all of this extra bass. That's literally what it says, by the way. I've talked to compressors and that's literally what they say. Those words exactly. And suddenly they have to respond to all of this extra stuff. And because they duck and have to work so hard to deal with it, The problem becomes that, of course, we lose volume rather than gain it, which is the opposite of what we usually want those moments to do. So how might we deal with that? Well, the other reason that we're using the Pro C2 for this, what I think is rapidly becoming a sub-bass management masterclass, is that we have the opportunity to monitor what we refer to as a sidechain signal. Okay, so what we're doing when we open up this panel is we have a chance to see the frequency content which is coming into our compressor. Bass is over here, treble is over here, and what we've got is a kind of EQ readout of our entire mix. Looks like this. And what we can see is our dominant sine bass moment, which is a huge, sort of enormous lump of content down here, much louder than everything else in the mix. So what if I could say to the compressor, hey compressor, I want you to continue to compress the signal that you're detecting, but I want you to spend less time analyzing what's happening at the low end and to potentially exclude that content from the way that you then compress the rest of the signal. It's an open question. I think I've been polite, and hopefully the compressor will respond to that request. So to repeat, what I mean is I want a way of being able to filter out the behavior of the low frequency content so that it has less of an effect on the way that the compressor is then going to respond. And we can do that right here. What I'm going to do is to hover over this low shelf and I'm going to turn it on. Now this low shelf is set at 100 Hertz and it's set at 24 decibels per octave, which means that by the time we get to 50 Hertz, this signal is half as loud as it is right now. Now, let's be 100% clear because it would be very easy to be confused here. I am not EQing the bassline. That's not what's happening here. What I'm doing is to use an internal EQ curve to prevent the compressor from using the whole of the bassline to influence the way that the dynamic response of the compressor is going to work. You can just rewind that sentence if you want to. So suddenly, when we use a filter to roll out the influence that the ultra low end has on the way that a compressor works, we get around all of the problem of all of that ducking. And we're back to a point now where the bus compressor is only rolling out about -3 dB of volume. Now, let's be 100% clear. If you're now thinking, I can stop watching this video, I now know how to fix my mix. Well, not necessarily, because the sub bass level might still be absolutely enormous from a purely volume perspective, which means that probably what you then need to do is to say, okay, in terms of getting the level of that right within the context of my mix, I'm still going to need the volume fader, and it might still be a really good idea for me to potentially slightly EQ that sound as well, maybe just making life a bit easier for the speakers by using a low cut at an amazingly low frequency to get rid of ultra sub parts of the waveform. So the idea of potentially slightly EQing this sound, as well as getting its volume right, all of that is going to help when it comes to balancing sub bass as well. How does it sound now with really low frequency rolled out? This is 30 Hertz now. So I've got a little bit of EQ on this sound and I've turned it down a bit. But here's another warning, because of course we could think, right, actually that does sound better. What I need to do is just to keep EQing it. Well, remember, it's a sine wave, so the moment I get up here, not going to hear it anymore. Why can't we hear it anymore? That's right, it has no harmonic content above this point. So we need to be careful with EQ, but we also need to be careful with our compression amounts as well. Now, why did I bring another sound into the mix? Well, this is a sound. I'm going to just get rid of our sine bass and come back to this sound instead. This is a retro synth sound. This is also a very low-endy kind of a sound. Sounds like this. Much more square in terms of the way that it sounds. But the reason that I have brought this sound in is because this sound, because it's a square wave, does have harmonic content. So what we can see here is that I've got a cutoff frequency which is towards the bottom, so we're losing most of that high end at the moment. But if what I wanted to do would be to say, okay, I want this sub bass sound to sound like this, but I just want to feel a little bit more presence on the start of each note, instead of pushing up the overall filter amount, which is going to make the whole sound brighter, one thing I could do would be to introduce more envelope. And what that's going to do is to take the filter envelope shape, this shape here, and it's going to make that envelope influence the way that the filter then behaves. And what that's going to give us is a little bit more front on the start of each note, but retain the sense of this basically being a sub-bassy sound at its core. So you can see that at a setting of 0, we've just got our kind of sine wave. And the moment I start introducing a little bit of envelope, what happens is we're just pushing up the start of that note. And again, it's giving us a little bit of presence. And what that means is we can hear the bass note clearly every time a new note plays, but then it sort of stops being a brighter sound and just becomes a sub. So again, if what we've got is a shape that has the potential for that harmonic content, this is another way of being able to manage sub bass. So what we've done in this episode is to talk an awful lot about the kind of pitfalls of what can happen at the low end. Remember, they are many. Your speakers, your room, the sound that you choose, the harmonic content in that sound, the implications for the harmonic content of that sound on the output stage of your mix, how you might get around the problem of a sound not having any harmonics by potentially using plugins like saturators and distortion units to bring harmonics to sounds, or potentially designing sounds of your own in synths which have all of those extra harmonics which you're choosing to filter out most of the time. Bass is complicated. There's no two ways around it. As always, you're going to need to move to use your ears, not to move your ears. Don't do that. To use your ears, and definitely to test your mixes in as many different places as you can, on as many different speaker systems as you can. And by the way, for everyone who's been watching through their laptop, I promise there was bass in this video.